Sarah still has the $300. It sits in an envelope in her desk drawer, untouched, because spending it feels like accepting payment for something she can't take back. She's tried to throw it away twice, but every time she gets close to the trash can, her hands start shaking and she puts it back. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's a reminder. Or maybe, deep down, she knows that money was never really meant for babysitting at all. It was payment for something else entirely, something she didn't understand until it was too late. 6 weeks ago, Sarah agreed to watch her neighbor's daughter for 4 hours. She thought she was doing them a favor. She thought she was just helping out a struggling family in her apartment building. But the moment Mrs. Patterson showed up at her door that October evening, Sarah should have known this wasn't a normal request. Mrs. Patterson's hands were trembling when she knocked, and when Sarah opened the door, the woman looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Dark purple circles hung under her eyes, and her skin had this gray, waxy quality that made her look 10 years older than she probably was. She didn't ask if Sarah was available. She didn't make small talk or explain why she needed a sitter so urgently. She just stood there in the doorway, gripping a crumpled piece of paper, and said she'd pay $300 to watch Emma for 4 hours. Just 4 hours. At the time, Sarah was working 2 jobs and still coming up short on rent every month. $300 for 4 hours of work was more than she made in a week at the coffee shop. It seemed like a gift from the universe, the kind of lucky break you don't question. So she didn't. She should have asked why Mrs. Patterson was offering so much. She should have wondered why the woman wasn't calling a professional service or asking one of the other neighbors who actually had kids and experience. She should have paid attention to the way Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked when she said Emma's name, like she was afraid of her own daughter. But Sarah needed that money, and desperation makes people ignore things they shouldn't. Mrs. Patterson handed Sarah the list of instructions before she could even say yes, like she already knew Sarah would agree, like she'd known from the start. Most of it seemed normal enough. Bedtime routines, allergies, emergency contacts. But then Sarah got to the bottom, and there were 3 rules written in different ink, like Mrs. Patterson had added them later, like they were afterthoughts that became necessities. Don't let Emma tell you stories. Don't believe anything she says. And whatever you do, don't go into the basement. Sarah remembers laughing nervously and asking if Emma was going through a rebellious phase or something. Mrs. Patterson didn't laugh. She just looked at Sarah with these hollow, exhausted eyes and said Emma was having nightmares. That was the word she used. Nightmares. Not tantrums. Not behavior problems. Nightmares. And the way she said it made Sarah's stomach turn, because it wasn't concern in her voice. It was fear. Raw, desperate fear. But Sarah took the job anyway. She watched the Pattersons practically run to their car like they were escaping something. She stood in their doorway with that crumpled list in her hands, and she told herself she was overthinking it, that $300 was $300, that 4 hours would pass quickly. Then she turned around and saw Emma standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at her with eyes that seemed too dark and too knowing for a 7-year-old child, and Sarah realized she'd made a terrible mistake. The list Mrs. Patterson handed Sarah was written on lined notebook paper, the kind torn hastily from a spiral binding with ragged edges still clinging to one side. Sarah unfolded it while Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway, shifting her weight from foot to foot like someone who couldn't stand still, like staying in one place too long might let something catch up to her. At first glance, the instructions seemed ordinary enough. Emma's bedtime was 9 o'clock sharp. No sugar after 7:30. A glass of water on the nightstand, not too cold. The emergency contacts were listed at the top in neat handwriting, phone numbers underlined twice. Sarah skimmed through it quickly, nodding along, already planning how she'd spend that $300. But then her eyes caught the bottom of the page and her stomach dropped. 3 rules were written there in different ink, darker and more frantic. The pen pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through in places. The handwriting was shakier too, like Mrs. Patterson had added them in a rush, or while her hands were trembling. Rule number 1, don't let Emma tell you stories. Rule number 2, don't believe anything she says. Rule number 3, whatever you do, don't go into the basement. Sarah read them twice, trying to make sense of instructions that seemed designed for a prisoner rather than a 7-year-old girl. She looked up at Mrs. Patterson and managed a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood that had suddenly become suffocating. She asked if Emma was going through a difficult phase, maybe acting out at school or having trouble adjusting to something. Mrs. Patterson didn't laugh. Her face remained completely blank, expressionless, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made her human. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said Emma was having nightmares. Just nightmares. That was all. But it wasn't the word itself that sent ice down Sarah's spine. It was the way Mrs. Patterson said it. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. Her hands, already trembling, started shaking harder, and she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. And there was something in her eyes, something Sarah couldn't quite identify at first because it seemed impossible for a mother to look at her own child that way. Then she recognized it. Fear. Pure, desperate, bone-deep fear. Mrs. Patterson was terrified of Emma. Sarah should have handed back the list right then. She should have said she'd made a mistake, that she wasn't the right person for this job, that maybe Mrs. Patterson should call a professional service or a family member. But the $300 was already in her hand, the bills still warm from Mrs. Patterson's pocket, and Sarah's rent was due in 3 days. Desperation has a way of drowning out the voice in your head that knows better, the instinct that screams danger when every logical sign points toward running. The Pattersons left at exactly 7 o'clock. Sarah stood in their doorway and watched them walk to their car, and it wasn't until later that she realized they didn't walk at all. They fled. Mr. Patterson got behind the wheel without looking back even once, his shoulders hunched like he was bracing for something to grab him from behind. Mrs. Patterson paused with her hand on the passenger door and glanced back at the house, just once, and the expression on her face made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the look of someone escaping. The look of someone who knew they were leaving someone else behind to face something they couldn't. Sarah turned back toward the apartment, that crumpled list still clutched in her hand, telling herself she was overthinking this, that 4 hours would pass quickly, that $300 was $300. Then she looked up and saw Emma standing at the top of the stairs, perfectly still, staring down at her with eyes that seemed too dark and too aware, and every instinct Sarah had been ignoring suddenly started screaming that she'd made a terrible mistake. Sarah forced herself to smile, the kind of bright, cheerful expression adults use when they're trying to convince children that everything is normal, even when it isn't. She called up to Emma, her voice artificially light, asking if the girl wanted to come downstairs and watch a movie, maybe have some popcorn. Emma didn't respond right away. She just stood there at the top of the stairs, head tilted at an angle that seemed wrong somehow, not the curious tilt of a child trying to understand something, but mechanical and deliberate, like something mimicking human movement without quite understanding why humans move that way. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was completely flat, stripped of any emotion or inflection. She said the man in the basement wanted to meet Sarah. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah felt her smile falter and crack. She pulled out Mrs. Patterson's list with trembling fingers and found rule number 3 again. Don't go into the basement. And there, beneath it in smaller, more frantic handwriting, was an addition she'd missed before. If she mentions the man, ignore her. It's not real. Sarah took a deep breath and tried to redirect the conversation, suggesting cartoons and coloring books and all the normal things children were supposed to enjoy. Emma came down the stairs slowly, taking each step with careful concentration, and Sarah noticed she never blinked once during the entire descent. The girl sat on the couch with perfect posture, hands folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes never left the basement door across the room. Sarah turned on a cartoon, something bright and colorful with cheerful music, the kind of show designed to make children laugh. Emma didn't react. She didn't smile or frown or show any interest at all. She just sat there, staring at that closed basement door, and 20 minutes passed in suffocating silence broken only by the artificial happiness bleeding from the television. Sarah kept glancing at Emma, trying to convince herself this was normal childhood behavior, that some kids were just quiet and shy. Then Emma spoke again, and this time her words made Sarah's heart stop. She said he knew Sarah's name. Before Sarah could process that statement, Emma continued in that same emotionless monotone. She said he knew about the accident, the one Sarah never talked about. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah's hands went cold and clammy. 8 years ago, when she was 16, Sarah had been driving when her car hit a tree on a rain-slicked road. Her best friend died in the passenger seat. Sarah had been the one behind the wheel, but she'd lied to the police and told them her friend had been driving. She'd carried that guilt, that terrible secret, for 8 years. She'd moved to this town specifically to escape that past, to start over where nobody knew her name or her history. She'd never told anyone here. Not her coworkers. Not her landlord. Nobody. Sarah's voice came out as a whisper when she asked Emma how she could possibly know about that. Emma slowly turned her head, and when she looked at Sarah, her eyes seemed darker than before, like someone had poured ink into them until the whites disappeared completely. When she spoke, it wasn't just Emma's voice anymore. There was something layered underneath it, something deeper and older that made Sarah's skin crawl. Emma said he told her things. He showed her things. He showed her what Sarah did that night, how she lied, how she let someone else take the blame even in death. Sarah grabbed her phone with shaking hands, desperate to call Mrs. Patterson, desperate to get out of this house. No signal. She tried again, watching the bars flicker and die. Her phone had full service when she walked in. Now there was nothing. She ran to the kitchen landline and picked up the receiver. Dead silence. And that's when she heard it, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind the basement door. Something was moving down there in the darkness, something that had been waiting for her. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button and let me know in the comments if you've ever ignored your instincts about a job or situation. Sometimes the warning signs are there, but we choose not to see them until it's too late. The sound from behind the basement door started as a faint shuffling, like something heavy being dragged slowly across concrete, metal scraping against stone. Then came the breathing, deep and wet and labored, each inhale rattling with fluid that didn't belong in human lungs. Sarah backed away from the door, her eyes locked on the doorknob, watching it like it might explode. Emma remained on the couch, sitting with that same perfect posture, head tilted at that impossible angle, and when she spoke again her voice carried no emotion at all. She said he'd been waiting down there for a long time. He'd been patient. He'd been searching for someone new, someone who carried guilt like a weight on their chest, someone who'd made a choice they couldn't take back, someone whose shame made them vulnerable to things that fed on regret and self-loathing. Sarah's back hit the wall behind her. The temperature in the room was dropping so rapidly she could see her breath forming clouds of frost in the air. The windows began fogging from the inside, condensation running down the glass in rivulets that looked disturbingly like tears. The basement door was closed. Locked. Sarah remembered checking it when she first arrived, testing the handle out of nervous habit, confirming it was secure. But now, as she stood frozen against the wall, she watched the doorknob begin to turn. Slowly. Deliberately. Like something on the other side was savoring the moment, drawing out her fear, feeding on the terror that radiated from her in waves. Emma smiled, and when she did, Sarah saw her teeth. There were too many of them. Far too many. They were too sharp, too long, arranged in rows that shouldn't exist in a human mouth. The girl's jaw seemed to unhinge slightly, stretching wider than any child's face should allow, and that smile held nothing of innocence or childhood. It was ancient and hungry and wrong. Emma whispered that he was coming up now, and her voice echoed strangely in the room, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The basement door opened just a crack, just enough for Sarah to see the darkness beyond, but it wasn't normal darkness. It was thick and viscous, moving like liquid shadow, pulsing with a life of its own. The breathing grew louder, closer, and then came footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy, slow, methodical. Each step creaked under impossible weight, and with each ascending footfall, the house itself seemed to react in pain. The lights began flickering erratically, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls. The floorboards groaned and warped. That unnatural cold spread through the room like freezing water, and Sarah's teeth began chattering so hard she thought they might crack. Through the crack in the doorway Sarah saw it. A shadow that stood too tall, its silhouette wrong in ways her mind struggled to process. It had too many limbs, or perhaps its limbs bent at too many angles, joints appearing where joints shouldn't exist, reaching and grasping at the air with movements that defied anatomy and physics. Then Emma's voice came from directly behind Sarah's left ear, even though the girl was still sitting on the couch across the room, still smiling that terrible smile with those impossible teeth. The voice said Sarah should have stayed. Should have met him properly. Should have accepted the invitation. Now he would have to find her instead, and the hunt was always so much more satisfying than simple greeting. Sarah didn't think. Her body moved on pure instinct and adrenaline. She ran for the front door, her hands fumbling desperately with locks that seemed to fight against her, and burst out into the cold October night. She ran to her car, hands shaking so violently she could barely get the key in the ignition, and in her rearview mirror she saw the Patterson house with every light inside flickering like a strobe, and in the upstairs window stood a silhouette impossibly tall with arms that reached too far in too many directions, and Sarah drove toward the police station without ever looking back. The police officers at the station were kind to Sarah, more patient than she deserved given how she must have looked stumbling through their doors at nearly 10 o'clock at night, pale and shaking and barely able to form complete sentences. They sat her down in a quiet room and brought her water she couldn't drink because her hands were trembling too badly to hold the cup steady. They could see the terror was genuine, that whatever Sarah believed had happened wasn't something she was making up for attention or drama. Her pupils were dilated with shock. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. She had the look of someone who'd seen something that broke their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. They sent 2 officers to the Patterson house to check on Emma and make sure the child was safe. Sarah waited in that sterile room, watching the clock tick forward with agonizing slowness, convinced they'd find the house in chaos, lights still flickering, that things still lurking in the basement or maybe standing in the doorway waiting for more prey. When the officers returned 40 minutes later, their expressions told Sarah everything before they even spoke. The house had been quiet. Normal. All the lights were off except for a small lamp in the living room casting a warm, peaceful glow. They'd knocked, and Mr. Patterson had answered, looking confused and genuinely concerned about why police were at his door asking about his daughter's well-being. Emma had been in bed, sleeping peacefully under a comforter decorated with cartoon characters, her small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of innocent childhood sleep. The officers had checked on her personally, and she'd looked like any other 7-year-old girl, peaceful and sweet, with no trace of those impossible teeth or those 2 dark eyes. They'd checked the basement too at Sarah's insistence, and found nothing but old furniture covered in dust sheets, cardboard boxes labeled in fading marker, and a water heater that hummed quietly in the corner. Empty. Completely, utterly empty. The officers suggested, with the kind of gentle concern reserved for people who might be having a breakdown, that Sarah had perhaps experienced some kind of episode brought on by stress and exhaustion. These things happen more often than people realized. Working multiple jobs, financial pressure, lack of sleep, the mind could play tricks, could create vivid experiences that felt absolutely real in the moment. Maybe she dozed off on the couch and had an incredibly vivid nightmare. It wouldn't be the first time someone's brain had manufactured something terrifying from anxiety and fatigue. But Sarah knew what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what Emma had said about the accident that nobody in this town should have known about. The Pattersons never contacted Sarah after that night. They didn't call to ask why she'd abandoned their daughter. They didn't demand their $300 back. They didn't file any kind of complaint or express any concern about the babysitter who'd fled their house in apparent terror. Nothing. Just silence. 3 days later, Sarah finally worked up the courage to walk down her hallway and look at the apartment across from hers. The windows were dark. She stood outside the door listening for any sound of life inside and heard nothing. She knocked anyway, her knuckles rapping against wood that somehow felt colder than it should. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. A week after that night, Sarah saw a realtor in a professional blazer showing the Patterson apartment to a young couple with a baby. She approached them, her heart pounding, and asked the realtor how long the Pattersons had lived there before moving out. The realtor's face scrunched in confusion. She pulled out her tablet, scrolled through records and frowned. According to the property management database, that apartment had been vacant for 2 years. The previous tenants had moved out after a family tragedy. Their 7-year-old daughter had died in an accident. In the basement. Sarah tried to move on with her life, throwing herself into work shifts that stretched longer than they should, picking up extra hours she didn't need just to avoid being alone in her apartment with her thoughts. She stopped walking past the Patterson apartment, taking the long way around the building to reach her door, and she tried to convince herself that if she didn't think about that night, if she didn't acknowledge what happened, it would fade like a bad dream until she could convince herself that's all it ever was. Then yesterday morning she found a letter in her mailbox. There was no stamp pressed into the corner, no return address written on the back, no postmark indicating it had passed through any postal system. It was just there, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a credit card offer, as if someone had placed it directly inside her locked mailbox without opening it, as if it had simply materialized where it needed to be. Sarah's hands started shaking before she even opened it, some primal part of her brain recognizing danger before her conscious mind caught up. Inside the envelope was a single piece of construction paper, the cheap kind they give to children in elementary school, slightly rough to the touch. A drawing had been made in crayon with the careful precision of a child who'd taken their time. Two figures stood side by side. One was a stick figure girl with long hair and solid black circles for eyes, pupils absent, just darkness filling the space where a child's innocence should have been. The other figure was taller, much taller, drawn as a shadow rather than a person, with arms that extended like tree branches reaching in all directions, too many joints bending at wrong angles. At the bottom of the page, written in a child's uneven handwriting, 6 words that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. He said thank you for opening the door. Sarah stared at those words until they blurred, her mind racing through that night over and over again. She never opened any door. She never went near that basement. She ran. She escaped before that thing could emerge fully from the darkness. But maybe that's exactly what it wanted all along. Maybe the physical door was never the point. Maybe fear itself is an invitation, an opening that doesn't require hinges or handles or keys. By acknowledging that thing existed, by hearing its presence spoken through Emma's voice, by allowing terror to flood through her and validate its reality, Sarah had opened a door she didn't know was there, one that existed somewhere between belief and denial, between the world as it should be and the world as it actually is. Because now, late at night when Sarah lies in her bed trying to sleep, she hears them. Footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment door. Heavy, slow, deliberate. The same methodical pace she'd heard on those basement stairs. She gets up and looks through the peephole, her eye pressed against the cold brass, and the hallway is always empty, bathed in the fluorescent lighting that never quite reaches the corners. But she can hear breathing on the other side of the door, that same wet, labored breathing that doesn't belong to anything human, and sometimes she swears she can feel warmth seeping through the wood like something is pressed against the other side, waiting patiently for her to open up. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn when the world is suspended between night and day, Sarah sees it in the corner of her bedroom. A shadow standing too tall, too wrong, watching her with eyes she can't see but can feel burning into her skin. The $300 still sits in her drawer, untouched, and Sarah finally understands what that money really was. It wasn't payment for 4 hours of babysitting. It was payment for something else entirely, a transaction she agreed to without understanding the terms, and whatever she purchased that night with her desperation and her willingness to ignore every warning, the price is still being collected, and the debt is far from paid. So what really happened to Sarah that night in the Patterson apartment? Was Emma truly possessed by something ancient and malevolent that had been waiting in that basement for someone vulnerable enough to acknowledge its existence? Was that house a doorway to something dark that feeds on guilt and shame and the secrets people carry? Or did Sarah stumble into a trap designed specifically for her, tailored to exploit the one thing she'd spent 8 years running from, the truth about who she really was and what she'd done? The truth is, we may never fully understand what occurred in that apartment, and perhaps that ambiguity is the most terrifying part of all. Because Sarah has evidence that it was real. She has $300 that came from somewhere, paid by someone, for something. She has that crumpled list of instructions with its 3 ominous rules. She has bruises on her arms from where she slammed into her car door in her panic to escape. She has the memory of Emma's voice revealing a secret that nobody in that town should have known. And she has that drawing, that terrible crayon drawing with its message thanking her for opening a door she swears she never touched. But she also has police reports saying the house was empty and peaceful. She has realtor records showing that apartment had been vacant for 2 years. She has officers who saw nothing supernatural, nothing that couldn't be explained by exhaustion and stress. So which version is true? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the real horror isn't figuring out what happened, but understanding why it happened to Sarah specifically. This story raises questions we all need to consider. How much would you accept to ignore your instincts when every fiber of your being is screaming danger? What's the price of silence when warning signs are written in bold letters right in front of you? And maybe most disturbing of all, once you acknowledge something dark, once you give it your fear and your attention, can you ever truly escape it? Sarah made a choice that night. She chose $300 over her safety. She chose desperation over caution. She chose to ignore rules written specifically to protect her. And perhaps most crucially, she chose to carry guilt and shame for 8 years instead of facing the truth about the accident that killed her best friend. That guilt made her vulnerable. That shame created a crack in her armor. That secret became a doorway that something patient and hungry could slip through. We all carry things we'd rather forget. We all have moments we wish we could take back, choices we regret, truths we've buried so deep we've almost convinced ourselves they never happened. But those secrets don't disappear just because we refuse to look at them. They sit inside us, festering, creating weak points where darkness can seep in. And sometimes, in our most desperate moments, when we're willing to overlook obvious warnings for the promise of relief, those weak points become doorways we didn't even know we were opening. If you've ever ignored your instincts about a situation, if you've ever taken a job or made a choice that felt wrong but you did it anyway because you needed the money, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes talking about these experiences helps us understand the decisions we make, and maybe it helps someone else recognize the warning signs before it's too late. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe to Miss Creepy Face. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story that drops. Until next time, stay safe and remember, some invitations are extended without you ever saying yes, and some debts can never be fully paid. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.